In this second module on the topic of regulatory monitoring, we'll cover both import and commercial monitoring. First, import monitoring. Import monitoring takes place at land and water-based border entry points where goods cross from one country into another. In all countries that currently mandate rice fortification, import monitoring applies to fortified rice, premix, vitamin and mineral blends, and fortified kernels that come from another country. It does not apply to rice flour or foods made with rice flour. However, that could change in the future. Before we move on, a reminder. This module will not cover premix, given that the dusting technology for rice fortification is not commonly implemented. Finally, the two broad categories of imports that will be discussed in this module include fortified rice and fortification inputs. When government officials commit to import monitoring under mandatory fortification, they are, in an actionable manner, telling the local rice millers that they believe both imported and domestic rice should compete under the same conditions. Imported fortification inputs also need to be monitored to verify that they were produced by reputable companies and contain the proper vitamin and mineral compounds and quantities. In most cases, import monitoring activities are conducted by border inspectors in conjunction with customs personnel. I will use the term border control to encompass both. First, let's talk about fortified rice imports. Upon receiving a fortified rice consignment, border control should make sure that 1. Each batch has its own Certificate of Analysis, COA, with the required information listed, such as name of manufacturer, batch number, date of production, expiration date, and micronutrient content. The fortified rice should be traceable to the original producer, despite the involvement of many traders in the supply chain. 2. The labels on the pallets, boxes, or bulk containers have not been tampered with and correspond to the COA. 3. The external packaging is intact and free from damage that could jeopardize product quality. 4. If shipped as a market-ready product, the rice sack should provide evidence of fortification, such as a fortification logo and/or the added micronutrient ingredients. 5. The product texture, appearance, and smell should resemble unfortified rice. If a COA is missing, the batch should be held until one is provided and verified. If any of the other points are not satisfied, the fortified rice should not be accepted. Sampling and testing are other considerations for imported fortified rice. For countries that have a registration program in place for imported goods, here is a possible protocol to follow. If a consignment of fortified rice arrives from an unregistered brand, that brand should always be sampled and tested. The details will be described momentarily. The sampling protocols for registered brands of fortified rice should be determined by stakeholders and added to the program's legislative documentation prior to the start of the rice fortification program. The volume of rice imported and the capacity of border inspectors to conduct sampling procedures should both be taken into consideration. At a minimum, registered brands of fortified rice should undergo sampling and testing 1 time per year. Now, let's talk about the sampling methods for a lot of imported fortified rice. First, 6 single samples of approximately 250 grams each are collected at random from different rice sacks, or during bulk transfer of the same brand. 100 grams of each are tested qualitatively at the border, usually with the iron spot test. If all the samples fail the test, then the lot of fortified rice should be rejected. If the iron spot test results vary, there are a few options. For example, in the case of fortified rice shipped in bags, let's say that one of the 6 samples failed the iron spot test. In this case, a border control inspector may take an additional sample from the bag representing the failed sample, or from another nearby bag. Alternatively, the inspector may take another complete set of samples. Fortification stakeholders should determine the proper protocol for dealing with mixed results prior to the start of the fortification program. As always, the protocol should be listed in the program's legislative documentation. If all the samples are fortified, the brand is registered, and the lot of fortified rice passes through the border to be sold in the marketplace. The remaining portions are combined to make a composite sample. This is sent to a designated laboratory, often affiliated with the government, for quantitative analysis of at least one marker nutrient. If the lab finds that the composite sample does not comply with the fortification standard, the border inspector should be immediately notified. The brand should be put on a non-compliance blacklist. The company authorized to import the brand will be notified of the quantitative results and the new blacklist status of the brand. Future consignments of that brand should then receive more attention, but at the expense of the importer. Please note that border control agencies may already do something similar in your country by elevating a food or company status from low or medium risk to high risk if it is found to violate food safety regulations. The protocol for dealing with subsequent batches of a blacklist brand needs to be determined by stakeholders prior to the start of the rice fortification program and included in the program's legislative documentation. Here is one suggestion. Upon arrival, the previously mentioned quality checks, such as review of the certificate of analysis and the iron spot test, should be conducted. Assuming everything is in order, at least one composite sample can then be prepared and sent for testing. Rather than allowing the batch of fortified rice to enter the marketplace right away, blacklist brands should be held at the border until the test results are available and indicate compliance with the specifications of the fortification standard. To ensure that the product does not remain in unfavorable conditions at the border for a long period of time, the sample should be given top priority at the laboratory, again, at the cost of the importer. Next up, import monitoring for fortified kernels and vitamin and mineral blends. Recall that the latter may be imported if a mill decides to produce fortified kernels on site. Upon receiving a batch of fortified kernels or a fortificant blend, border control should make sure that 1. Each batch has its own Certificate of Analysis, COA, with the required information listed, such as name of producer, batch number, date of production, expiration date, and micronutrient content. 2. The labels on the pallets, boxes, or bulk containers have not been tampered with and correspond to the COA. 3. The external packaging is intact and free from damage that could jeopardize product quality. 4. The product texture, appearance, and smell should be appropriate. If a COA is missing, the lot should be held until one is provided and verified. If any of the other points are not satisfied, the product should not be accepted. Here is a possible protocol to follow for sampling and testing imported fortification inputs. When a batch of product from an unregistered manufacturer arrives at the border, inspectors obtain and send a single 200-gram sample to a lab for quantitative testing. The purpose is twofold. First, to ensure the reliability of the COA, and second, to verify compliance with the country's fortification input formulation specifications, if applicable. For registered manufacturers, at least one time per year, a single 200-gram sample of product is collected and sent to a lab for quantitative analysis. Unlike rice, fortification inputs can be tested quantitatively using only single samples. All have high micronutrient contents and are expected to be homogeneous when produced by a reputable supplier. Ideally, all micronutrients will be analyzed at the laboratory, but testing a single marker nutrient is acceptable. If the lab finds that the composition of the product is not adequate, the shipment should be returned to the manufacturer. Faulty product, especially if used to fortify large quantities of rice, will jeopardize the impact of the fortification program. Now, let's move on to commercial monitoring. Commercial monitoring activities are conducted in the marketplace, at grocery stores, open-air markets, and convenience shops, for example. It verifies that rice available to consumers complies with the specifications of the Fortification standard in terms of the micronutrient content, sanitation requirements, packaging, and labeling. Non-compliance at the commercial level acts as a red flag. It alerts inspectors that earlier monitoring processes conducted at the manufacturing site, blending site, or border control site may not be adequately documented or adhered to. Though any country can initiate commercial monitoring activities, stakeholders typically place more emphasis on external and import monitoring. And here's why. There are usually far fewer rice mills and border entry points than commercial locations that sell rice. Devising a plan to effectively monitor thousands of rice retail locations is usually expensive and time-consuming. However, there are a few cases when commercial monitoring is highly encouraged. If the country has a vibrant black market, for example, rice is sold or traded unofficially to the retail market. If the country has porous borders, which enable rice to enter the country without inspection by border control officials. Both of these can lead to the infiltration of unfortified rice into the marketplace, undercutting the efforts of companies that comply with the country's fortification requirements. Additionally, if country leaders decide to conduct a national nutrition survey, they may want to temporarily engage in commercial monitoring activities. Such data collection can indicate to what extent the fortification program is actually reaching the public. Due to the large number of commercial outlets in a country, developing a plan for executing commercial monitoring activities and sampling rice from commercial locations is vital. This takes time and should involve all stakeholders. In preparation, stakeholders should discuss and officially document the following. First and foremost, will the information collected through commercial monitoring activities contribute to understanding the status and quality of the rice fortification program? Additional topics for consideration include annual training for inspectors, inspector time, transportation costs for inspectors, funds to purchase rice at the commercial outlets, material costs, such as containers to hold the samples and information leaflets to give to retailers, shipping costs for samples, level of categorization for samples by rice type, rice brand, or rice producer. This will be elaborated upon momentarily. And finally, the capacity of laboratories to process samples. This will impact the number of samples that enumerators can collect during commercial monitoring activities. For commercial monitoring, rice packages and samples are collected throughout the year in a systematic manner as prescribed by the country's monitoring plan. For countries with porous borders, the focus may be on the main markets in the surrounding area. Upon entering a location to collect samples, the inspector should show her or his credentials, and ideally pass along an information leaflet to the manager of the location. The inspector should then record vital information about the retail space, such as store name, location, and date of visit, on a data collection form. This is eventually passed along to the Food Control Authority or other designated receiving entity. Now, the inspector is ready to obtain samples of fortified rice using the country's monitoring plan and sampling guidelines as a reference. Inspectors may collect sealed 500-gram packages of fortified rice for ease. However, if the packages of fortified rice sold in the store are only of a larger size, the inspector may collect samples amounting to approximately 500 grams from the packages. Each of these samples should be placed in a designated container. Each package of fortified rice or filled sample container should be marked with a unique sample number, which is also written into the data collection. Next to the sample number, inspectors should record relevant information from the rice package, such as brand name, indication of fortification, lot or batch number, and expiration date. Any damage to the packaging should be noted as well. Hypothetically, let's say a country requires all white rice to be fortified. During the visit, inspectors should also scan the store to be sure that unfortified white rice is not available for sale. If the inspector is suspicious of a brand, for instance, if there is no indication of fortification on the package, pictures of the package should be taken, and information about that brand should be collected and reported. Fortified rice sold from open containers in a market can be sampled as well in similar amounts. The inspector should gather as much data as possible about the location and the fortified rice. Ideally, the fortified rice will still be stored in its original sack, like you see here, so that the inspector can review the label. The fortified rice samples should be taken from the larger barrel, sack, or bucket using a sampling spear or other appropriate collection tool, and then placed in designated sample containers. Each sample container should be marked with the same sample number that is written on the data collection form. Fortified rice samples, whether in packages or in designated sample containers, should be taken or sent to the Food Control Authority or other designated entity, along with the relevant data collection forms and any pictures taken. At the receiving location, the samples should be split into at least two. One part is sent to the government's designated laboratory, and another is kept at the receiving location as a reference until the laboratory results are obtained and deemed acceptable by all parties. At the laboratory, portions of these single samples are tested qualitatively, often for the presence of iron. Composite samples are then formed in line with the categorization defined in the country's sampling guidelines, such as by brand or producer. Each composite sample then undergoes quantitative testing. Assuming the country requires more than one variety of rice to be fortified, such as long-grain white rice and short-grain white rice, composite samples can be prepared at the broad level of rice variety. For this, the laboratory staff would simply mix equal parts of samples from the same rice variety, regardless of the brand or producer. To create a producer-based composite sample, single samples from different brands of the same producer can be combined. To create a brand-based composite sample, single samples from different packages and batches of the same brand can be mixed in equal parts. Please note, if aggregation is done by rice variety, and the quantitative results on the composite sample are concerning, the laboratory staff will not be able to determine which producer or brand should be contacted. Each country's monitoring plan should describe the conditions under which a producer or brand can be labeled non-compliant. For example, a producer or brand may be considered non-compliant if fewer than 80% of the composite samples attributed to that producer or brand over a 6-month period comply with the iron specification of the country's fortification standard. The monitoring plan should also stipulate how to deal with non-compliance for both local and foreign companies. For example, if a local producer or brand is labeled as non-compliant, notification of the findings should be provided to the relevant company. Subsequently, audit and inspection visits at the respective mills should be done more frequently for a predetermined period of time as written in the monitoring plan. If a foreign producer or brand is found to be non-compliant, the importers should be asked to inform the respective companies of the results and implore them to correct the situation for subsequent batches of fortified rice. Border control should be informed to pay close attention to those producers or brands found to be at fault. Now that we've reviewed how to conduct regulatory monitoring activities, we'll discuss how you can use this information to track program compliance. Remember the term indicator from the module about planning a monitoring system? They are specific factors that can be assessed or measured. Some regulatory monitoring indicators that can be tracked as part of a monitoring plan include 1% of mills with adequate quality assurance and quality control procedures in place. 2% of composite samples from mills, import sites, and retail locations that comply with the specifications of the fortification standard based on quantitative tests. 3. Percent of imported batches of fortified rice with a complete certificate of analysis. 4. Percent of commercial locations that sell only fortified rice as indicated by the fortification logo on the package. For all of the indicators listed, the percent is expected to rise over time. Remember, in each country, stakeholders should determine what indicators make the most sense for their program in consideration of financial and personnel resources. Now, let's go over 2 examples. First, in a country, there are 5 mills with the capacity to produce between 50 and 100 metric tons of rice daily, and 24 mills with the capacity to produce 20 to 50 metric tons of rice daily. After inspecting all mills, inspectors found that 26 mills had adequate quality assurance and quality control procedures in place. The numerator is the number of mills with adequate quality procedures in place as assessed by an inspector during a specified period of time, for example, annually. In this case, that number is 26. The denominator is all mills in the fortification program that were assessed by an inspector during the same period of time. In this case, that number is 29. To calculate the indicator, simply divide 26 by 29 and multiply that by 100. The answer is 89.7% of rice mills had adequate quality assurance and quality control procedures in place. Now, on to the second example. A country initiated mandatory fortification of white rice, both domestically produced and imported, 2 years ago. Stores are only supposed to procure white rice that is fortified as indicated by the country's fortification logo. As part of a recent national nutrition survey, a commercial monitoring component was included. Enumerators visited a total of 300 commercial locations that sell white rice. Of those, 273 stocked only fortified white rice as indicated by the logo. The numerator is the number of commercial locations that only stocked fortified white rice, in this case 273. The denominator is the total number of commercial locations that were visited as part of the survey, in this case 300. Thus, 91% of the stores complied with the requirement to only procure fortified white rice. That concludes the regulatory monitoring modules. You can find forms for capturing monitoring data in the Resources section for this module. Those that reference wheat flour can be altered easily to capture data on rice. Next, I'll briefly describe the purpose of management systems for ensuring product quality and safety in mills worldwide.